It's the Real News. I'm Aaron Mate, and we are live today. I'm here with Real News senior editor Paul Jay, and we thank those of you who were patient with us as we started a little bit late. We are talking today about the latest in the Trump-Russia story, one that has dominated U.S. politics for well over a year now. But I think it's safe to say that right now it is at its most intense moment. This was prompted by Trump's comments at a news conference in Helsinki after his summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin. And standing side by side, Trump told reporters that he did not automatically side with U.S. intelligence agencies in their conclusion that Russia meddled in the 2016 elections. And he also said that Putin had offered a very strong denial. This prompted a national freakout in the U.S. With cable news hosts calling it disgraceful. Former CIA Chief John Brennan called Trump treasonous and said that that act alone of not siding with the U.S. intelligence community was amounted to high crimes and misdemeanors. And just to give you a sample of the overall reaction that Trump's comments elicited, I want to play for you a montage of cable news hosts. This was put together by the right-wing site Newsbusters. And they added some music to this montage, which I apologize for, but the clips themselves are important. So here it is.
First of all, I just have to say I'm sick to my stomach. I'm really feeling nauseous.
Stunned, gobsmacked.
We're hearing words like, I feel sick, this is frightening, calling it an abomination.
Shocking.
Stunning.
Genuinely stunning.
What is going on?
Unbelievable.
Astonishing. Just astonishing.
It is astonishing, it's heartbreaking, and it represents, I think, a pivotal turn in our nation's history.
It's time for Americans to be out on the streets.
There were people protesting in the streets every day in the 70s. Why is that not happening now?
When do we see almost a shadow government come out and say, we cannot side with the government?
As an American citizen, I just personally think today is just an incredibly depressing moment in our time, in our history as an American.
So that's a sample of what we saw on cable news in the aftermath of Trump's comments in Helsinki. So amid that outrage, Trump returned back to Washington, and the grief over his comments was so strong that he was reportedly convinced by his aides to walk them back. So at a meeting yesterday with Republican lawmakers, Trump said that he walked back his comments and that he had full faith in the U.S. intelligence community.
So I'll begin by stating that I have full faith and support for America's great intelligence agencies, always had. And I have felt very strongly that while Russia's actions had no impact at all on the outcome of the election, let me be totally clear in saying that, and I've said this many times, I accept our intelligence community's conclusion that Russia's meddling in the 2016 election took place. Could be other people also. There's a lot of people out there.
So that's President Trump. And then shortly after, he then went on to explain that he misspoke when he said in his news conference that he didn't see why Russia would meddle in the elections. He explained, he said, that he said the wrong word.
The sentence should have been, I don't see any reason why I wouldn't, or why it wouldn't be Russia. So just to repeat it, I said the word would instead of wouldn't. And the sentence should have been, and I thought it would be maybe a little bit unclear on the transcript or unclear on the actual video. The sentence should have been, I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be Russia. Sort of a double negative.
Now, Trump's comments, not surprisingly, because you can tell by his body language that it's quite likely he doesn't really believe what he's saying. And there are reports that to that effect as well, has not obviously contained the uproar. And we are seeing Congress members call for hearings. The translator who was present to interpret for President Trump in his one-on-one meeting with Vladimir Putin in Helsinki. There is talk of subpoenaing that translator to come to Congress. And this is a bipartisan uproar that Trump is facing. And among many things, it's sparked a great deal of uproar, not just against Trump, but against pretty much anyone who questions U.S. intelligence agencies and who also takes a different view than the bipartisan consensus around Russia, which Trump ran against during his campaign, where people who question U.S. intelligence are being called traitors. And there is a surge of chauvinism and nationalism right now that we have not seen in many years. And there's also the mainstreaming, as there has been for a while, of conspiracy theory talk, of talk that Trump is essentially a Russian asset. And to illustrate that, one more clip of Rachel Maddow on her news show.
I mean, for everything that we have been through as a country, for every kind of trial and challenge and intrigue and embarrassment and scandal that we have been through as a nation, we haven't ever had to reckon with the possibility that somebody has ascended to the presidency of the United States to serve the interests of another country rather than our own. What's the corrective to that? How do you remedy that? These are no longer hypothetical questions.
So the questions that we want to address today, and we have Real News senior editor Paul Jay here for that, are what is the impact of this culture right now, this mainstreaming of conspiracy theory talk around Trump? And far beyond Trump, what is the impact of this surge of nationalism, of Russia baiting, of blind reverence for intelligence agencies, and this talk of treason for people who question them? So, Paul Jay, you are in Baltimore. Thank you for joining us. I'm wondering, as you take in all this, as you hear those clips that I've just played, your thoughts?
I don't want to repeat any of the words we just heard. Shocking and so on. First of all, the sharks see blood in the water, and they're getting ready to pounce on President Trump as much as they are going to be able to. The question is, why do these sharks want to pounce on President Trump? The American state has great divisions, and sections of the state are at war with each other. Sections of the oligarchs have deep divisions. There's a lot of reasons to want to see Trump attacked. He is probably the most dangerous president in the history of the country. The thing is, he needs to be critiqued, he needs to be attacked, he needs to be exposed, but for the principled reasons, for the right reasons, for the policy that he's instituting. The Russia piece of this is the least of the issues. The divisions in the state, an American state, I think, and I don't have an insider's view of it, but from what I can see, it's on various levels why there are such sharp divisions. There is a cabal of people around Trump. We've told the story of Robert Mercer, the billionaire who brought in Bannon and Kellyanne Conway, John Bolton. There's a very far-right, extreme hawkish group that has, I can't say seized the White House because they did get elected, for whatever that's worth. But they have a very clear, very aggressive agenda, and that, I'm very sorry. I so many times tell people to turn off their phones, and here's me with trying to figure out which device is ringing here. So hang on, I will get rid of this, and we're live, so I'm going to have no way to cover up the fact.
We are live. So
I was too stupid to.
We are live. So, Paul, let me cut in and just say that we are live, and we're taking your questions. So if you have them, you can tweet them in using the hashtag TRNN Live. You also can post them on Facebook if you're watching it there, or on YouTube, and maybe on Instagram as well. I don't know. But however you use social media, use the hashtag TRNN Live and post your questions there, and we'll try to get to them.
Okay,
Paul,
so I'll continue. So the reasons that are being given for attacking Trump simply don't compute. He's an autocrat. Well, since when do the Chuck Schumers of this world, or any of the leading Republicans of this world, who are so now even they are outraged about dealing with the gangster Putin, since when do they care about autocrats? One of the closest allies of the United States is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, that is waging an illegal war in Yemen, that waged an intervention into Bahrain to suppress legitimate peaceful protest in Bahrain, that is funding jihadists all over the region and all over the world, that Senator Bob Graham says is implicated even in the 9/11 attacks in the United States. How is it that that's an acceptable ally? And Putin and the Russian government, which has its own list of crimes, there's no doubt. But in terms of international footprint, even just never mind the United States, which is criminal number one when it comes to international activities for at least since World War II, if not before. But even just compare what Russia has done internationally to what the Saudis have done. I mean, yes, you can critique, and even any language you like, Russia and Putin for propping up Assad, who, yes, he's a murderous dictator, but he's also a murderous dictator that collaborated with the United States after 9/11 and putting people like Maharar in jail and torturing them, working closely with the U.S. administration. But it's Saudi Arabia that was instrumental in destabilizing Syria and taking a situation of what, as I understand it, relatively peaceful protest and turning it into an armed civil war that has killed hundreds of thousands of people and displaced millions. Just the comparison of the Saudis and the Russians shows the hypocrisy of why Putin is enemy number one. So it's not because he's an autocrat, because clearly Americans love autocrats as long as they're pro-American. So what? He suppresses his own people. Well, again, the Saudis and any other number of American allies you can mention. There's far freer elections, and they're not free in Iran, but there are freer elections in Iran than there are in Saudi Arabia, yet Iran gets demonized, and Saudi Arabia, again, is an ally. Compare Israel, the occupations in the West Bank and the savaging of Gaza by Israel. That's an acceptable thing. So let's get real here about what's really motivating this onslaught against Trump for the alliance with, not alliance, but meeting with Putin and such. Now, I'm not saying Trump's a peacenik, and nor is Putin. In fact, I think the real story of those meetings is that they are plotting something very dangerous. And I think they're plotting a way to go after Iran. And I think the Russians are going to be in on this, because all the Russians have to do is not do with Iran what they did with Syria. And, and this is speculation on my part, but if you put this into the context of what Netanyahu's been asking for, what the Saudis have been asking for, what the UAE, United Arab Emirates, has been asking for, is they want Putin to push Iran out of Syria. And if he does, Netanyahu has made it clear that Israel will accept the Assad regime, not do anything to destabilize it. There's not yet apparently a deal on whether the arms will still go through Syria to Hezbollah. But the real deal going on here with Trump, Putin, involves Netanyahu, the Saudis, and the UAE. That's the real danger of these meetings, is that they're plotting war of some kind against Iran. Not that they're just playing footsie, but you don't hear any of that in the political establishment or the corporate media going after Trump. And why it's important is, one, too many of the people going after Trump would love him to go after Iran. I'm sorry, going after Trump over the Putin issue. Like when Trump did throw this one missile at Syria, that's Chuck Schumer says, finally, Trump looks presidential. Many of the political forces that are trying to weaken and wound Trump on the Russia connection will be cheering him on when the day of a real attack on Iran takes place, and I think that's highly possible. The other part of this, and why it's important to expose the reasons they're going after Trump. And let me say again, there's so many better reasons to go after Trump, is this idea that the Russians have attacked American democracy. And we need to talk about just what American democracy is, because we're being fed this chauvinist American exceptionalism, McCarthyite even vision, this idyllic American democracy, which doesn't exist. And frankly, has more or less never existed, but it sure doesn't exist now. And as I've said on Real News before, the real danger to what amount of democracy there is gerrymandering, is the amount of money controlling the outcome of politics, voter suppression, and so on. I mean, that's the real threat to what kind of democracy there is. But let's really, on the nose, talk about just what is this American democracy? What do people get to choose when they vote? And don't listen to me. Here's George Will. This is a clip we have back in the, I guess, the 2016 elections. This is George Will talking about what people get to choose between in American democracy.
Surely in a democracy, it's time for us to quit being sentimental and say the question we settle in an election is not whether elites shall rule, but which elites shall.
There we have it. Not whether the elites should rule, but which section of the elites shall rule. So why should we get caught up in a fight between different sections of the American oligarchy? Why do we need to side with one section or the other? Why should we get caught up in a fight between the American oligarchy and the Russian oligarchy? We need to look at these issues from the interests of the people and not get caught up in the propaganda wars of the oligarchs.
I want to read a comment from viewer Kristen Lee, who writes, "There are too many lucrative salaries on the line that depend on that $1 trillion a year military budget to allow Russia to end up being boogeyman number one, to have Russia not end up being boogeyman number one, I believe. They are fighting for their own lifestyles." And I think that speaks to a broader point that the Russiagate narrative is one that sustains privilege, because really, who does it threaten? I mean, yes, it threatens Trump, but we already know that there's a huge cross-section of the elite that despises Trump, including many Republicans who campaigned against him during the campaign. And of course, Russia has no huge, powerful lobby in Washington. Russia has no major economic power in the U.S. So attacking Russia really hurts nobody domestically in a position of privilege and influence. And meanwhile, attacking Russia serves a double benefit of allowing people then to deflect from other interests, much more powerful than Russia, that are doing real damage here at home, as Paul has been talking about. Let me ask you about China first, because
okay, before we do China, let me just add one thing to this, which I think, while the importance of the existential threat of Russia, the importance of that narrative to the military-industrial complex is, I think that's only one piece of why the American state and large sections of the American oligarchy see Russia, I don't so much as a threat. They keep using the word adversary. And the reason why, I think, is there's several pieces to it. And I said this in the interview the other day. One, the United States does not like regional powers that are not under the American thumb. They don't want anyone. The United States wants what they call in some of their documents full spectrum dominance. They want global hegemony. Global hegemony means hegemony in every region of the world. They do not like it when any power emerges that challenges for regional hegemony, because that's obviously part of global hegemony. So they don't like the fact that Russia has a major economy, not one of the biggest economies by any means, but a major economy, a big army, of course, nuclear weapons. So they don't like that it has such, kind of an independent will in this region. It's not a global competitor. But there's another piece. There's another piece to this. Russia has oil. They don't like an oil state, a country that has such massive oil supply, not being under the U.S. umbrella, U.S. hegemony. That's number two. Number three, they don't like the way Putin and that state emerged. You know, if people are watching the series that I'm doing of interviews with Alexander Buzgalin, we're telling the whole story of the emergence of Putin out of the collapsed Soviet state, Soviet system. In the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a free-for-all plundering of all the natural resources and state resources, privatization mania. And the US, the Americans thought they'd get a much bigger piece of this. I don't think they thought, after all these years of trying, they thought, bringing down the Soviet Union, in truth, the Soviet Union fell mostly for internal reasons, and bureaucrats within the party and the state became the oligarchs, became the billionaires. They seized a lot of these assets, not the West and the Americans. And out of the chaos emerges a Russian state led by Putin to create some sense of normalcy, turn it into kind of a normal capitalist country with laws to some extent so you can do business and commerce. And one of the things that state did is it didn't allow the West to just hocus pocus, I forget the term. They didn't just allow the West to come in and pick up all these resources and privatization directly themselves. So this Putin state's been to some extent blocking the U.S. from turning this Russia, as they have with most other areas of the world. Of course, the other big exception is China and then Iran, into the American global capitalist system, where the Americans are the dominant power. And they even had ways to do that, but these things jive, don't always jive, I should say, which is the economic incorporation of Russia into global capitalism, even into the EU, for example, or some structure like that, does not jive with the narrative of an existential threat that serves this massive military expenditure. So different parts of the U.S. state have different agendas connected to different sections of capital that have their other agendas. But none of this justifies this McCarthyite level of Cold War rhetoric.
Right. So in terms of China, as we're talking about other possible explanations for Trump's desire to work with Russia that go beyond him being a potential intelligence asset, or that Putin has compromat on Trump, which really is right now the dominant corporate media narrative and question. You've been laying out some. I want to focus on China for a second and actually read to you, Paul, a quote. This is John Pomfret. He's a historian, and he writes about Kissinger talking to Nixon after Kissinger returned from China as part of the Nixon administration's overture to China in the early 70s. And Kissinger observed to Nixon, he says, in 20 years, your successor, if he's as wise as you, will wind up leaning towards the Russians against the Chinese. And then he went on to say, right now, we need the Chinese to correct the Russians and to discipline the Russians. So I found that interesting because, A, it's a way to help understand what might have motivated Nixon's overture to China back then. But also, I think it might help us understand what might motivate Trump's overture to Russia now. Obviously, China has been a huge obsession of Trump's. He talks about it constantly. He's launching a trade war right now. And it's quite likely, I think, he recognizes that if he really wants to confront China, a far bigger world power than Russia is, especially obviously economically, then he might need to enlist Russia for that task.
I certainly think there's part of it. How conscious Trump himself is of these kind of geostrategic assessments and plans, I don't know. Trump's a very smart con man. I don't know that he has a big geopolitical brain. But that being said, he's got people around him, including John Bolton, who are actually quite smart and have real geopolitical brains and are fanatics. My guess is the short-term play, and I don't see this. I think it's ridiculous that Trump is a Putin stooge and all this. The agenda of this group that's in power and that Trump represents the interests of, this isn't just a one-man band, even if he's flies off at the handle in a one-man way. But this agenda of Iran and China, was very well articulated by Steve Bannon before and after the victory of Trump in the election. Excuse me. This has economic interest, which of course, China is the real economic competitor in the world that's a threat to American dominance. But it also has an ideological framing for it, and that's the defense of Western Christian civilization. And I think they believe in this stuff. Bannon himself is connected to Opus Dei in the Catholic Church. He's connected to Cardinal Burke. They're waging a war against Pope Francis. They want to overthrow the Pope, and it's really as open as that. They're shocked that they got a Pope that's a social democrat. The metaphysical vision of the world, and don't forget, Hitler had quite a metaphysical vision of the world. The role of the mission of the Aryan nation to take over the world and march into a new era of civilization and all this was all intertwined with a metaphysical, quasi-fanatical religious view of the world. Well, I think they have this. So China does not fit the plan of saving Western civilization, but Russia does. And Putin is very close to the Russian Orthodox Church. He's been promoting this kind of nationalism intertwined with the religious messaging through the church. He promotes this kind of stuff in Western Europe. Putin has been nurturing the far right in Western Europe. And so this jives. The agenda of the people around Trump and Putin have similar views of the world. And it is a far right view of the world. So yeah, the idea of some kind of accommodation with Russia because of the coming trade war and who knows what kind of war with China, yeah, this is definitely, I think, part of the equation. The shorter term play is Iran. This group, this cabal in Washington is fixated on regime change in Iran. I'm actually not sure why they see that fits the China strategy, but I don't know that it matters because that's their play, and they've been talking about it for years, since the late 1990s, and this document, Project for New American Century. Undoing the Iranian Revolution has been absolutely at the core of these people's foreign policy. So all these things are interconnected, and dividing Russia from China and having clearly some kind of alliance there. It's also in the interests of Putin, but it's very much in the interests of this cabal. I think we should even stop talking and being so focused on Trump, because if they bring down Trump the individual, they'll find some other individual to come play a similar role, and whoever he or she is won't be such a clown. Right, and what's amazing is that meanwhile we're seeing Democrats take part in calls for even a military coup. I saw one Democratic lawmaker basically call on military leaders to assert their authority in response to Trump's comments in Helsinki. I want to read a comment from another viewer. Julia Morris writes, "Can you please point out how Trump has not been tough on Russia? He stopped arming the Syrian rebels last year when Putin told him to. He refused to enforce stronger sanctions. He invited Russian spies to the White House who had previously been banned from coming in the country. And Trump said today, no one has been tougher on Russia. That's got to be BS. Julia, I'm going to disagree with you. I'm going to actually argue the contrary. I'll tell you why. If you look at what Trump has done since taking office, he's been far more, his policies, not his rhetoric, his policies have been far more hawkish on Russia than Obama was. I mean, critically, Obama refused to arm the Ukrainian government in its fight against pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine. Obama came under very heavy bipartisan pressure for that in Washington. Pretty much everybody wanted to, but he reportedly said that he did not want to further inflame the proxy war on top of what the U.S. had already done there, because the U.S. played a critical role in setting off that entire mess in Ukraine. Trump has bombed the Syrian government
which is Putin's ally, twice now. He has killed, the U.S. has killed Russian mercenaries in Syria. Firing on Russians in Syria, or even on the Syrian government, is something that Obama never did. He has conducted massive Trump has conducted massive war games on Russia's border. He has admitted a new member to NATO, Montenegro. Although last night on Tucker Carlson, he did say that he had mixed feelings about that. That if he could do things over, he might do things differently. But he still oversaw it. He has signed some sanctions. And in terms of letting Russian spies into the country, well, U.S. has admitted Russian intelligence officials as part of routine meetings, which everybody does. So there's a very long list of areas where Trump has actually been harder on Russia than Obama was, including, by the way, in Trump's nuclear and defense strategy, where Russia is named in both cases as a major threat, especially in the defense strategy. Russia and China are named as bigger threats to the U.S. Than even terrorism. Paul, I wonder if you have thoughts on this.
Well, I differ a little bit from what you're saying, in the sense I think a lot of the moves that Trump made, he made under great pressure, because he was going against decades and decades of U.S. Foreign policy, which has Russia as the existential threat. And this, as I was saying earlier, I think in Trump Bannon-esque view of the world, Putin's on the side of Western Christianity. And I don't think we should underestimate the significance of that in these people's view of the world. Not to say there aren't deep economic interests, and one of those deep economic interests is when Tillerson was Secretary of State. I mean, Tillerson, they had an enormous energy play ready to go in Russia. You know, the plan was, and this is part of these pre-inauguration meetings that take place between the Trump camp and the Russian camp, is this deal about lifting the sanctions and embargo and such, and allowing this massive energy investment to take place. And Putin was going to, as I said earlier, there's a lot of pent-up frustration in Western capital, not capitals, money, amongst pools of capital, that they couldn't play and get hold of Russian energy assets as easily and freely as they can in many other places. And this was going to be Putin saying, yeah, lift the sanctions and you can come in and do this big, Exxon, you can have this big play here. And Tillerson was going to engineer it all. So I think there was a new kind of accommodation being planned by Putin, by Trump with the Russians. I think there's truth to that. And the measures that he took that look like they're against Russia, he did under duress. And also, you know, the other thing that needs to be understood, as much as it's ridiculous to say everything that goes on in Russia, Putin controls, it's just as ridiculous to think that everything goes on in the American state, Trump controls. You know, the Pentagon's an enormous establishment. It has a lot of this independent decision-making power. Other sections of the state, they're very strong. The apparatchiks, to use the Russian term or Soviet term, in the American government, there's a lot of power there. Trump isn't just deciding everything. And I doubt, given who Trump is, he barely reads briefings. He hardly knows anything what's going on in his own government, would be my guess. So I think there is something to that Trump's, you know, Trump definitely was on a different course with Russia. Now, from the point of view of us, ordinary people in this country, is that so bad? A different course with Russia. And I would argue that it's not that much different to have more commercial relations with Russia than it is with, you know, any other country. You know, Russia is not an existential threat to the United States. And even this idea that, you know, somehow if it wasn't for the U.S., Russia would march and take over Western Europe. It's ridiculous. The idea of you know, colonizing is nuts. Ever since England gave up Canada because it cost too much money to have colonies, like controlling other countries is extremely expensive. Even the United States, when it wins wars, doesn't really want to directly run countries. It just costs too much. It's way better to use, you know, what they call soft power, the power of money, have local elites that are your allies. You know, they call that the system of like neo-colonialism. And Russia doesn't have the resources to play in that kind of competitive way with the United States. But someday, if China wants to go down that course, someday maybe China would have that kind of power. So, but yeah, I think it's fair to say that. But Trump was having, wanted to have a more accommodating commercial relationship. Now, it may also turn out that Trump is up to his eyeballs in potentially illegal dealings with various Russian oligarchs. To me, there's a lot, smoke and fire in that direction. In the Mueller investigation, that's probably really where they're going to find stuff. That's quite different than whether Russia meddles in the elections and what the outcome of that was. And there's no doubt, I mean, from what I can see, there's probably no doubt that Trump has all kinds of shenanigans going on with Russian billionaires. But that's also kind of normal.
Right. Well, it is normal. I actually don't agree with that. From what I've looked at, I just don't draw that conclusion. I think if that was true, we would have known about it by now. That amount of money, I think, is difficult to hide for so long. And, Mueller does have Trump's tax returns because the IRS has them. So I suspect we would know about them. And by the way, Cy Hirsch says this too, according to what he knows, for what that's worth. But I think where we can definitely agree is that, and you alluded to this, is that the...
Wait a second. Hang on. You're saying you don't think Trump has dealings with Russian oligarchs and they didn't help finance real estate dealings in New York?
I think it's true that a major Russian oligarch bought one of Trump's houses in Florida. We know that. And it's true that...
way overvalue.
Sure. Okay. Yes, that's true. And it's also true that some Russians have bought, money in Trump properties. But what a lot of people miss, and this is this is noted in David Korn and Mike Liskov's book, Russian Roulette. Trump actually doesn't necessarily make money off of those deals because many of the properties that Russians have supposedly bought into are just Trump licensed properties, properties where he's already licensed his brand. So he's already taken a small cut. So this
maybe that's true because that's the official version on the Toronto Trump Tower, but there's quite a bit of evidence that that's not true. That there's a lot more going on. Anyway, I'm not on top of the detail of that, but we will see what comes out of the investigation. But there's a lot of potential corruption and shenanigan in Trump's relationship with on the financial side. But he's not the only one. And there's all kinds of sections of the elites of various countries doing exactly the same thing.
Right. And where we agree, I think, is that this question of has Trump been tough enough on Russia, presuming that being tough on Russia would be a good thing, ignores all the many harmful things about a confrontational posture towards Russia, primarily the threat of nuclear war. As Trump has been noting, although probably disingenuously, because I don't think he has any intention of reducing nuclear stockpiles, but the U.S. and Russia account for 90% of the world's nuclear stockpiles, and cooperation with Russia on that front especially would be a good thing. And a political culture that incentivizes toughness on Russia is one of the reasons why the Bulletin of Atomic Sciences has raised their doomsday clock closer to midnight. And it's one of the issues that have been overlooked in this focus on Trump and Russia.
But let me just one other thing. I just want to hammer this again. What the Russians have done compared to what the Saudis have done, you can't compare Crimea, where the majority of people speak Russian, and most of the evidence I've heard is whatever referendum was held there, the likelihood is the majority of people would have voted to join Russia. But you can't compare whatever happened in Crimea to the Saudi war on Yemen. It's incomparable. I mean, thousands and thousands, I believe hundreds of thousands of people have been killed in Yemen. So why isn't there screaming about the Saudis in Yemen, yet there's no end to talk about Crimea, where even Henry Kissinger says Crimea is an exception and shouldn't be treated as a rule, and there's an understandable argument why Russia took this position on Crimea. I'm quoting directly Henry Kissinger.
Right. I mean, this gets to what happened in Ukraine, and the argument there is that basically no rational Russian leader, no matter how dovish and liberal would have done anything differently than what Putin did, based on the prospect he faced of his neighboring country after a U.S.-backed coup, a coup that the U.S. was a part of, overthrowing Yanukovych in 2014. The prospect of that country then joining NATO, where he had, and then taking Crimea as well, because Crimea was in Ukraine after it was given to Ukraine by the Soviet Union decades before, being a part of NATO. So Putin acted on that front, which we can discuss maybe at another time. But all this speaks, Paul, I think, to what you mentioned before, which is this notion of American exceptionalism, not holding ourselves and our allies like Saudi Arabia to the same standards that we hold other people, where we hold other people to standards that we never apply to ourselves, which speaks to how we are even discussing this issue as a national crisis to begin with, because what is Russia accused of doing to the U.S.? It's accused of hacking emails and running a social media campaign, which by anyone who's looked at the material was pretty juvenile, and of potentially hacking into some voter databases, although that's a murky story that is worthy of discussion, but it's lengthy. So on that front, I want to play another clip. This is Jill Wine-Banks. She was a prosecutor during the Watergate case, and she was speaking on MSNBC. And Paul, I want you to hear what she compared, Monday's moment of Trump doubting U.S. intelligence agencies to. This is what she said.
It's just as serious to me as the Cuban Missile Crisis in terms of an attack or the 9/11 attack. The president is taking the side of the people who attacked us instead of trying to prevent a future attack. He has done nothing to make sure that the elections 4 months away are going to be safe. And I would say that his performance today will live in infamy as much as the Pearl Harbor attack or Kristallnacht. And it's really a serious issue that we need to deal with.
I missed who was that?
That was Jill Wine-Banks. She is now an MSNBC analyst, but she was a prosecutor in the Watergate case against Nixon. So we have 9/11, we have Pearl Harbor, and we've heard that before. That's not novel to her. Many people have adopted that, pundits across the spectrum, lawmakers. But what I hadn't heard yet in all these historical analogs that have been invoked to talk about alleged Russian email hacking, hacking of the DNC and juvenile social media ads and alleged bots, is Kristallnacht, the 1938 pogrom in Germany by the Nazis against Jews. So her saying that Trump questioning U.S. intelligence agencies will take its place in history alongside Kristallnacht. Paul J.
Well, what can you say? The level of idiocy that we're hearing on corporate news. I mean, she's beyond idiotic. I'm actually, if one's going to be concerned about this stuff, more concerned of what you showed earlier, what's coming out of the mouths of supposed journalists that are supposedly rational. I mean, she's a nutcase. So I would, sometimes when they assess a measure of things, they take people off the extreme on one side, takes people off the extreme on the other, and measure the middle. So I wouldn't even count her. She's just too nuts. But the whole level of rhetoric, we need to try to understand better why it's at such a crazy fervor, and it's a convergence of interests here that are converging on anti-Trump. Now, let me first of all say, I welcome all of it in a sense. I don't like all the crazy propaganda about American democracy, which doesn't exist in the way they talk about it. The anti-Russia stuff is dangerous because the two nuclear powers. But the fact that the American government, the state, is so dysfunctional, and that this Trump administration is so relatively paralyzed by all this is a good thing. I like when they all fight with each other. I just don't think we, as rational people, should buy into the rhetoric and BS on any of the sides of this. And we need to help, as the Real News, our job is to help make realistic sense of this so ordinary people don't get fooled by it so easily. I mean, to compare this to anything at the level of war, Pearl Harbors and all this, it's just inflammatory for nothing.
All right, Paul, so let me go to some questions for you, because I have some questions like about this issue. And this speaks to what's going on the left right now, because this issue has become very divisive on the left. I personally saw on my Twitter feed many people who I really respect parroting or echoing the lines of others that Trump's comments doubting U.S. intelligence agencies were treasonous, and using that kind of language. And we're seeing a real split right now. So let me read you a few viewer comments. Christian DeVries writes, Paul, why do you think and I love this question, by the way, because I think it points out that we've been the exception. Why do you think progressive online media outlets are not questioning Russiagate? Except for the Real News, I should add, Christian. And Dave Rubin writes, Paul, I've actually been accused of treason by left-wing family members for voicing similar lines of argument. This Russia stuff is totally stifling. How do we combat this? And finally, Carlo Mando writes, why does pointing out that current liberals are hypocrites automatically make the person pointing these things out a Trump supporter?
The Cold War, the McCarthyite period, the House of Un-American Activities Committee coming out of World War II is deep in the American psyche. United States coming out of World War II, soldiers coming back, especially black soldiers, but poor working class soldiers that went to fight against fascism and fight for democracy, came home and they said, we want some of that democracy and freedom. Because, coming out of the crisis of the 30s, the amount of attacks on unionization, the denial of people's democratic rights, and then now they're asked to go fight for all of this, and it's similar asking what Martin Luther King pointed out. You're asking poor white and black soldiers to go to Vietnam and fight for ideals they never see at home. So coming out of World War II, United States and American people were very poised for quite a radical move. And politically, the person that most represented that was Vice President Henry Wallace, Roosevelt's vice president, that had a progressive agenda, both economically and geopolitically, that is far to the left of Bernie Sanders. And he was vice president. Well, he gets overthrown in the Democratic Party convention in, I guess it's 45, and he gets replaced with Truman. And this, what follows is an attempt to undo the strength and influence of progressive public opinion in the United States. In Hollywood, in the unions, amongst teachers, in the government, a massive purge takes place. Thousands and thousands of people are fired for what they believe, not because they're doing anything that harms America, quite the contrary. It was a political, ideological terror campaign. And then, of course, the media is all in on this. Even after the downfall of McCarthy, I remember growing up, I used to see shows on TV, I was a communist for the FBI. The specter of the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. It's deep, deep in the American culture and psyche. So even when the Soviet Union collapses, because this was supposedly about godless communism, well, now you've got Christian capitalism, and they're carrying on exactly the same way. So now you got to wonder, what was this really all about? And it goes back to what I was saying earlier. It goes about a narrative needed by the military-industrial complex to spend $1 trillion a year on arms, the regional politics, and so on. It never was about what they said it was about. So I may have lost a little bit of train for what your question was, but the fear of the Russians, the idea that the Russians are this existential enemy out there coming to get us, this is what the liberals, the Rachel Maddows, are playing on. That whole establishment that's supposedly progressive are hearkening up a nightmare of the past that still lives in people's brains.
Paul, I'm reminded, as you're talking about Rachel Maddow and progressive, in one of the first segments we did, I had written a piece about Rachel Maddow, just critiquing her coverage. This is over a year ago. And you and I had a little tiff over whether or not we can call Rachel Maddow progressive. I argued, yes, we can. You argued, definitely not. After more than a year later, I totally concede that argument. You were 100% right. She has been.
I hope someone out there is writing down. Aaron actually said Paul's 100% right about something.
Oh yes.
People don't know how much we argue behind the scenes. We probably should do that more on camera.
Yes, it'd be more productive for everybody. Or not, actually. I don't know if people want to see us arguing. But, and you have many viewers, Paul, by the way, who are echoing what you're saying here about a distraction from the real issues and needing an enemy. Max writes, isn't Trump the best distraction while we're in the midst of the sixth mass extinction, absurd wealth equality, on the brink of financial collapse, and close to nuclear war? Liberals are upholding the institutions of our oppression and scapegoating Trump.
It's more complicated than that. If
Wesley, in Max's defense, he only has an internet field to write his comment. I mean, certainly.
Yeah. I would just say that Trump is not there as some deliberate distraction. He is, but Trump, the most important thing, and this is what doesn't get talked about enough everywhere, is we got to understand the underlying systemic reasons the political culture is in such decay. And the underlying issue has to do with the amount of wealth that's been transferred to so few hands and how parasitical it is. That wealth is not generating new production, new productive investment. That so much of the global wealth, something like, I think I said this before, the amount of money available for investment and speculation is something like $350 trillion when the global GDP is only $80 trillion. When you have the stage of capitalism of such parasitism, the politics reflects it. And Obama was this wonderful, charming, smiling face of the same decaying system. I mean, who does he appoint as his financial team? Obama, first thing he does is brings around him all the moguls of Wall Street who managed the 07-08 financial crisis in a way to make sure Wall Street comes out like bandits, and they are bandits. And so, but the point is the system itself is decaying, and we better recognize we're into a new phase of this system. And I keep harping on this. Imagine a system facing this apocalyptic crisis of climate change, and no one even talks about it. Like nobody. I mean, I shouldn't say nobody. Obviously, there's activists and all that. But I mean in terms of mainstream media, mainstream politics, it's barely recognizable on the agenda of things that matter. This is a sign of decay and not just about Trump.
Right. And so, Paul, it's interesting. You mentioned Obama. Yesterday, he gave this major speech at the Mandela Lecture where he criticized corporate globalization and talked about massive economic inequality and got a lot of attention for it. One of his comments was, there has been an explosion in economic inequality. A few dozen individuals control the same amount of wealth as the poorest half of humanity. That's not an exaggeration. That's a statistic. Think about that. That was Obama. And then, so the Twitter user...
Something he greatly contributed to.
Well, exactly. So the Twitter user, Pretty Bad Lefty, who I recommend people check out, is very good. He tweeted that and he wrote, damn, if only this dude had been in a position of power for almost a decade. So as we wrap up, Paul, I want to play a couple of clips, just as we're talking about now the utility of fear-mongering to keep people on edge and distracted away from meaningful change, and to keep them invested in this Russiagate narrative is pretty much the only political question hanging over the U.S. I want to talk a bit about the scare right now about alleged Russian meddling in the upcoming midterm elections. It was a subject of new controversy today when Trump, at a cabinet meeting, was asked if the Russians are still interfering, and he quickly just said no. And then he went on to say about how tough he was on Russia. But that is now a new scandal, and he's being Lindsey Graham is demanding he explain himself. And everyone is citing the recent warnings by his Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coats. He gave a speech on Friday, the same day, by the way, as the indictment of these Russian military intelligence officers. He gave a speech where Dan Coats talked about the warning lights are blinking red, and we've never seen such a perilous state since before 9/11, comparing right now to the days before 9/11, the period before 9/11. And this is Dan Coates in that speech.
And here we are nearly two decades later, and I'm here to say the warning lights are blinking red again. Today, the digital infrastructure that serves this country is literally under attack.
So that's Dan Coates. And now this prompted a huge round of alarm. Corporate media pundits talking about how Coates has talked about the warning lights, invoking 9/11. Is Trump going to protect us from the Russians? And this is a major topic of concern right now. Will Trump protect us from Russian meddling in the midterm elections? Nobody, and I mean nobody, ever asks, has Coates mentioned any evidence or has he even alluded to evidence of what the Russians are supposedly supposed to be doing to the midterm elections? Because there is none. Coates has said none. And the only thing he said in his speech about alleged Russian meddling in the midterms was this.
In regards to the upcoming midterm elections, I think there may have been some confusion between what we're seeing now compared to what we saw in 2016. Because as the Department of Homeland Security noted, we are not yet seeing the kind of electoral interference in specific states and in voter databases that we experienced in 2016. However, we fully realize that we are just one click of the keyboard away from a similar situation repeating itself. Therefore, and moreover, we are seeing aggressive attempts to manipulate social media and to spread propaganda focused on hot-button issues that are intended to exacerbate socio-political divisions.
So that's Dan Coates talking about what exactly he is so concerned about when it comes to Russian meddling. He says we've not seen the type of interference yet. And by the way, it's questionable whether there was any interference at all in 2016, but that's a side question. But then he talks about it being one keyboard click away. And Paul, what came to mind for me was these warnings back in the 80s of that the Russians could drive tanks from Nicaragua to Texas. And then he goes on to talk about the threat of social media. And so this is what right now corporate media pundits and politicians are literally freaking out about, hyperventilating about Trump not protecting us from social media activity, which, by the way, I mean, we know already from the indictments that it was probably likely a Russian clickbait commercial troll farm that was buying those ads that nobody saw, by the way, and that most of them ran after the election. And then the source for these claims about these Russian bots that we're supposed to be afraid of, it comes from this group called from a group that doesn't even name doesn't even identify what the bots are, what the Russian bots are supposed to be. It just says that they're out there. So, and this is what everyone has relied on to spread this fear about Russian bots. So, Paul, as we wrap, I guess your thoughts and your advice for people on how to navigate this climate of fear and fear-mongering going forward.
Well, let me first of all say, if Russia's doing what they say they're doing, I think they should stop doing it, okay? Russia has no business interfering in the elections of any country, and neither does the United States, and we don't need to go on about the horrible history of the United States doing these things to everyone else, but that also doesn't justify Russia. If they're doing these things, there's no justification, and they should stop it. But you know what the best defense of this would be? Because right now, what are we talking about? Messaging through social media, right? Well, why, the question needs to be asked, why are people susceptible to believe this bullshit? How come people can read the most ridiculous conspiracy stuff and think it's true? If you want to protect the American democracy, how about invest in the public school system? How about teach history? How about give people a sense of what real geopolitics are? How about talk about this massive income inequality now Obama talks about? You know, how about not appointing Goldman Sachs as your economic team at the time you had a chance to do something about it. But how about in the public school system, a massive education campaign to explain the real reasons for economic inequality? Because if people understood these things, they wouldn't fall for the crap that's being spread on social media. And whether it's being spread by the Russians or by a troll farm controlled by Cambridge Analytica and Robert Mercer and Steve Bannon, or corporate Democrats for that matter. The reason this stuff has influence is because so much of the American population has been so honestly uneducated, de-educated. People don't know basic history, don't know basic things about how the economic system works, and fall for the ridiculous kind of campaign promises of Trump, and maybe slightly less ridiculous, but also BS campaign promises of corporate Democrats. So the only real defense against this, because there's no technological defense unless you want to close social media, the only real defense is have a conscious, educated population. And that's what we're trying to do. So who's standing up most to Russian interference in the elections? We are at The Real News, because we're trying to educate people about the reality of the world.
Okay, and so on that front, we're going to end there. But I do want to take the opportunity to ask people that if you value what The Real News does, if you value the uncompromising analysis of the kind you just heard from Paul J., we ask you to please go to our website, therealnews.com, to support us. We can't do this without you. We don't take government or corporate money. And you can go to therealnews.com to donate there. We're currently in the midst of our summer fundraising campaign. Anything helps, and we really, really appreciate it. Paul J., senior editor of The Real News, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.